Okay, here we are for another micro lesson. This one will be longer than some because I think it's really important for those wanting to learn how to do identification of your bat calls, that you realize that the visual recognition of the calls, what they look like, is going to be very important as you get started. And based on experience, this is the fastest way to begin learning the calls. And this is like any other acquired skill. And it's both a left brain and right brain activity. For those of you not familiar with those terms, essentially it's been determined that we have two brains, a left and a right, and they are connected by a little neural connection. But your left brain is your verbal and rational brain. It thinks serially, reduces thoughts to numbers, letters, words. In other words, really good for analyzing numbers and statistics. Your right brain is the nonverbal. It's your intuitive. If you have a gut feeling that something is good or bad, that's your intuitive brain. Essentially, it thinks in patterns or pictures, whole things. It doesn't comprehend numbers, letters, or words. And there's a quote from a book from Richard Berglund. Your left brain includes all your analytical parts of analysis. So you'll use that when we start looking at numbers, call parameters, subtle nuances of values of bat calls. But that's going to be covered in other micro lessons, focusing on call parameters later in the series. This one focuses on your right brain skills. And again, it'll be a little longer than some of the micro or short lessons, as I believe that an experience shows. This is a key first step to mastering ID of your acoustic data. If you are or plan to be a bat biologist who uses acoustic IDs for conservation or ecology, then it's critically vital to master the basics. Keep in mind, none of us were born this way. There are no savants that suddenly come out of a dark closet and bingo, they can identify bats. This is an acquired skill. We acquire it by practicing, like bicycle riding, learning to play tennis, an instrument, a guitar, a horn, whatever, learning to draw, which is a good analogy, which I'll pick up on, or even mastering R programming language to do your statistics. The more time you spend looking at bat files and working on this, the better you'll become. Keep in mind that when you're beginning any new skill, it's always slow at the beginning because it's unfamiliar. But the more you do it, the more your skills improve with experience. And as this happens, your speed and accuracy in processing your bat calls will improve. Experience has shown in all the years I've been teaching acoustic workshops, those who are willing to invest in themselves and put in the time will be able to literally review and ID thousands of acoustic files in a day without undue stress. You'll get very good at it. The better you are, the faster you are. But it's slow going in the beginning because it's unfamiliar. But don't give up. You need to work at it. Like I said, it takes practice and you will rapidly advance. And over the 40 workshops I've taught, I found that learning to identify the bats is from the acoustic calls is no different than anything else. You just need to do it again and again and again. Actually, if you look at any top athlete, for an example, or a musician or artist or any acquired skill, a tennis player, They don't do it once and master it. They continue doing it again, again, and again. Nobody makes it to the Olympics by learning how to pole vault one time and then walking away and waiting for the next Olympics to roll around in 4 years. I find the quote from Kimon Nicolaides applies to learning how to ID bat calls. He developed a revolutionary teaching method for drawing. And here's his quote: "The sooner you make your first 5,000 mistakes, the sooner you'll be able to correct them." And I found this exactly the same with the bat calls. Until you go through your first 5,000 mistakes, you won't realize you've made them and you won't be able to correct them. So it's going to take some time, but I'm convinced anyone who's willing to put in the time will master this. Here's another quote from the art world: "Success is sometimes the outcome of a whole string of failures." Well, that was from one of my favorite artists, Vincent van Gogh, who noted this in his early days of painting. And this has been my experience since the early days of pioneering use of acoustic ID information for bats. For all of you, the goal is progress, not perfection. I'm never worried about new students or colleagues that are new to ID of acoustic data if they're making mistakes at the beginning. If they're moving ahead, that's all that matters. You want to progress. Don't worry about perfection and getting them all right. That will come to you. So it's no different than any other discipline that features taxonomic characters for identification. There's no question that if you're going to work in any other biological field, you would have to master basic vocabulary related to the taxa of interest in order to even understand the characters that are used to differentiate similar taxa. Here we go to your right brain right now. If you were going to do plant work, you would have to learn the leaf shapes. You don't need to worry about the technical words that are labeling each of these, but right now, your right brain can look at a grass stem and look at a pine leaf or a banana leaf or any of these others. And just visually, already your right brain has said these are all different. Later, as you get more experience, you can begin adding technical descriptions, but your right brain is already working for you. So for our New World neotropical species, what the call pulses look like is your very first clue to identifying them. But the important thing, and why I'm taking so much time today on this micro lesson, is this all depends completely on the software you're using and the display settings used. But your visual recognition is your first set of clues. Again, I keep repeating this, but that's what it takes. With repetition, you will become proficient in pattern recognition for families, genera, and species. Your brain is great at pattern recognition. In fact, when you're on the internet, pattern recognition allows you to move beyond various and sundry websites to prove that you're a human and not a robot. Let's look at all the squares with traffic lights. This is your right brain. Bridges, your right brain figures out the bridge. Oh, there's no bridge there, no bridge there, but your right brain immediately you recognize these patterns. So you're already trained in how to do this. It's just a question of honing your skills for bat calls. With experience, the visual shapes of the vocal signatures, it became clear that they had, all these vocal signatures had both family and genus specific traits. And this was some work that I and colleagues Jose Ochoa and the late Michael Farrell did in Venezuela in the late 90s. I think this is the first important lesson for all of you learning to recognize bat calls for neotropical species. If you change the way you look at things, the thing you look at will change. These are both the same thing, just looked at from a different perspective. So what we're going to review now is how to look at things properly so you'll recognize them. Visually, the shapes are going to be your first cues, again highlighted if displayed in a standard format. What is that? What's a standard format? A lot of bat call software thinks it's helping you and is constantly changing the screen shape, size, and parameters in order to fit the complete bat call that you may have recorded on the screen. That's not very helpful, actually. So let's go through what I think are good standard formats for you to learn your bat calls visually. A lot of the software tools are out there. Some are actually useful for identifying bat calls. There's a lot of them that aren't very useful. But we already know your human brain is great at pattern recognition. We evolved that way. If you're wandering through the bush and you see something long and skinny running across the trail in front of you, you're going to stop. Your brain immediately detects that might be a threat. It may be a fer-de-lance. It may be a venomous snake. Then your other brain analytical will kick in and go, oh, no, the colors are, it's safe. It's not dangerous. But your brain has evolved to recognize patterns. How many times have you recognized a friend or family member across the other side of a large parking lot or in a huge shopping mall just because of the color of their sweater, jacket, or the way they walk? I'm sure all of you recognize family members on the telephone when you answer the phone. They don't say, "Hi, I'm your brother Frank." You automatically recognize your brother, sister, mother, or father's voice. So you're good at that. So here's some examples of why using the same display settings will make it easier to recognize and learn call shape patterns. In this example, we've got two images that all of you would recognize immediately if they're displayed in a standard format. In this case, I'm using the analogy of bat call software, where the y-axis, which would be on the bottom, equivalent to our frequency. But in this case, it's too compressed to see any detail. But we have the two images. If we expand it a little better view, if you already know what we're looking at, you probably could identify these, but probably not at this stage. If you put them in the full access and display in a standard format, there's no question what we have on these two images. So, why it's reasonable to think of expanding your calls so you can see the full detail. This is the same whether you're using full spectrum or zero crossings format. And it also doesn't matter what software you prefer to use. The key thing, as long as you standardize your display, and once you've standardized it, always use the same display to view all of your call data. The best practice I've found is to have the x-axis, the time, which is on the bottom, set to 10 millisecond tick marks, or very close to that. The y-axis, which will go up the left side, which is your frequency in kilohertz, using a log scale, which we'll talk about shortly, with a frequency range set, say 15 to 120 kilohertz, or 10 to 110 kilohertz, depending on the bats in the area you're working. I'm going to use Analog W for the examples and call displays, and all the calls are displayed in zero crossings format. I use both Analog and Kaleidoscope and look at calls in full spectrum as well, but ZC is what I suggest is best for quickly learning how to ID your calls. This is what I've been using since the get-go back in the 90s when we first started pioneering all this stuff. Full spectrum was certainly available with some software at that time, and it is especially useful for some taxons like identifying some of the phylostomids, the Artibius and Brachyphyllum, and some of those because of the multiple harmonics. But for the most part, zero crossing will give you all you need to know for identifying your species. There are also a lot of reasons I recommend Analog W to use for your software, but I'll cover all of that in another micro lesson. Mainly, it's free. You don't have to buy an annual license of a couple $100 US. And so many of the software programs out there are annual license fees, whether it's Sonobat, Bat Sound from Lars Pedersen, or Kaleidoscope from Wildlife Acoustics. Analog is free, and I'll be able to provide copies to people that want that, and that'll be covered a little bit later. But it also has great utilities for data management, which speed up learning of your calls. And yeah, it does also display a full spectrum files. It's not limited to zero crossings only. So the first example I'm using is a call file of a widespread species, probably in all of your areas, Molossus molossus. Again, this is a zero crossing format display. The x-axis for the frequency is set with a range of 15 to 110 kilohertz using a logarithmic scale, which I'll come back to shortly. Changing the time axis is important to understand. This is the equivalent of magnifying a call file in order to see the pulse shape details. So here we are. The x-axis time scale, the tick marks down here are set to 1 second. This equates with real time. If you were looking at this bat in real time, this is 1 second. So looking at the bat call, it was only calling for about half a second. But if the real time 1 second tick marks, you can't see any details. So it's very difficult or nearly impossible to identify unless you've had a whole lot of experience. We expanded to 250 milliseconds, so we're magnifying the call. Expanding it to 100 milliseconds, that expands it even more. And at this scale, you can see some detail, but you still can't see enough for an identifiable pattern. Here, we've expanded it to 10 milliseconds. So each one of those is a millisecond or 10 milliseconds. And now at this scale, you can see the paired diagnostic pulses, which are diagnostic for identifying the species Molossus. So setting your x-axis, the time scale, to 10 milliseconds is a good place to start. While setting the magnification at 10 helps see call shapes, there's another important setting that was just used in the example. This is using what we call a compressed display. This provides a view of the complete call sequence with visually removing the space between the pulses. This is the time in the recording that the bat was not actively calling. So it's empty time between the pulses. To use this as an example, here's 3 commonly recorded species, our old friend Molossus molossus again. We'll look at the Emballonurids, Psychopteryx bilineata, and the Vespertiliana Dasypterus iga as examples to illustrate the difference. This is molossus uncompressed. The time scale isn't displayed here, but it doesn't matter. But this shows the long space between the pulses that the bat was emitting. So if we're looking at this in uncompressed, you can see that there's a couple of pulses there, but it doesn't really give you a diagnostic call shape. If we compress that and remove visually only the empty space between the pulses, you now can see the diagnostic paired pulses. And bingo, you can identify this as a species of molossus. All species in the genus have the same general format of paired pulses. The frequencies differ for the species, but you'll be able to recognize that. Let's look at Psychopteryx. Uncompressed again, empty space between the two pulses. We compress it, and now you can see the diagnostic paired pulses for Psychopteryx. These are one pulse, then a higher frequency pulse. Very characteristic. You can recognize that using compressed mode. Here's our Vespertilianid example. Well, we've got 3 pulses. Doesn't really tell us a whole lot. If we go to compressed mode, you see a whole lot more detail. Also, important in this detail is something about how the call pulses themselves are changing. And it turns out all of the Lazuarines, the species that were all lumped under Lazuarus, but are now 3 separate genera, they're all characterized by the characteristic frequency moving up and down. Bing, 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 bing. That's how you diagnose these and recognize them from all other Vespertilianids. Unless you're using the compressed view, this will not be obvious. So try not to display single isolated pulses. It's important that you display complete sequences. Use compressed displays to remove the empty space for viewing, and also use a time scale of about 10 milliseconds. Aside from defining the values of the frequency range that we were talking about, 10 to 110 kilohertz or 15 to 120 kilohertz, just like the time scale that uses compressed mode, it's important that you use a log scale for your visual recognition of species. What is that? Well, the frequencies are in a logarithmic arrangement. Here's 2 examples of the same call, and they're both set to 10 to 110 kilohertz. This is linear, where the spacing is just linear in 5 kilohertz increments. You'll notice everything is pretty much compressed. We have 3 species in this example, compressed to the lower part of your screen. So linear scale on your frequencies will distort the call shapes in lower frequencies versus higher frequencies. Now we go to the log scale, exactly the same scale, 10 to 110 kilohertz. And now this is a logarithmic scale. And look at, you can now see call shapes of all 3 species pretty well, and they're not distorted. If we had some Vespertilianids, like little Myotis or something, they would start showing up here, and they wouldn't be distorted. So this is displayed in a logarithmic or a log format. So the suggestion is not only set your frequency for the range of species in your area, but use a logarithmic scale, not a linear scale. Okay, to learn your calls, a lot of people are going to the literature and trying to find information on how to identify my calls. Well, a lot of the published work showing species calls aren't completely, but most of them are nearly useless for identifying your bats. Why? Most usually only provide graphics of a single pulse that's out of context of a full identifiable sequence. And the XY scales are not useful. They may be using a linear scale, they may be not using a compressed format, so you're only looking at a single pulse. It's not going to help you very much. Here's an example of the common species. Again, our old friend Sarcopteryx bilineata. It's displayed with a linear scale and it's not using a compressed mode. So there's milliseconds and you can see there's pulses. In fact, you can actually see the harmonics here, which are interesting, but that doesn't really give you the characteristic paired pulses that are diagnostic to immediately recognize the calls. So if you use a compressed mode, immediately you see the paired pulses, which are diagnostic. You don't see this in the published sonogram. So it's not helping you learn the calls very well by shape. So I'm repeating myself a lot, but that's because I want you to repeat, looking at your bat call files. Look at them again, look at them some more. Complete call sequences are necessary and need to be displayed in a standard format. As noted in the beginning of the presentation, vocal signatures have visual shapes that are similar within the families and genera. And this relates back to our publication from 2000. And before spending several weeks in the field, in one of my early acoustic workshops was taught in Venezuela. As with all of my live workshops, we spend time at night recording the bats. So the first night we spent recording bats for the students to look at their calls the following day in the classroom. This was one of the early discoveries of similarities of call shapes. So shortly after sunset, we wandered over on the campus of the university to a little garden area. Back then, we didn't have the equipment we have now, and we had to record in real time directly to a laptop computer. So I sat there with my detector watching the computer screen with the calls rapidly flying across the computer screen in real time. Suddenly, I recorded a sequence and saved quite a few of them that looked very familiar from earlier work in Northern Central America. I recognized the shape. I went, wait a minute, I know what that is. And then I paused and went, wait a minute, I don't know what it is because it's not at the same frequency as a species I knew extremely well. And this is what the calls look like. And what I thought of immediately, this looks like the fishing bat that we knew all throughout Northern Central America. However, its calls were quite different. It's a much bigger bat, or is a big bat, and usually size matters. Big bats have lower frequency calls than little bats. Well, we had harp traps set up as well out there in the garden on the campus. And then the mysterious call disappeared off my computer screen, and I went, oh gosh, we'll never know what it is. And about that time, one of the students began yelling, in Spanish, of course, we caught one, we caught one. So I froze my call on the screen in hopes that maybe they captured whatever bat that was. Turns out, compared with Noctilio leporhinus, the fishing bat, what we had caught there in the garden on the campus was the first verified calls of Noctilio albiventris. Immediately look at this. Your right brain already here today, for the first time probably, can recognize the call pulse shapes of both of these species. Give yourself 10 minutes and you will have mastered all the calls in one family of New World bats by visual shape. So how's that for quick learning? So here's an example using the standard display settings versus random. Assume your goal is to learn how to visually identify two species of emballonurids, our old friend Sarcopteryx, and let's try Centronectrus centralis. They both have similar emballonurid call shapes, but the call shape patterns are quite different. So we'll look at 20 calls. The first set are using the recommended x-axis set to 10 milliseconds and the frequency 10 to 110 using a log scale. The first call, and you see there's Centronectrus, Sarcopteryx, Sarcopteryx, Centronectrus, Sarcopteryx with a feeding buzz, Sarcopteryx. There's other species mixed in there, but we're not paying attention to those. More Sarcopteryx. Here's Sarcopteryx we identified here. There's a Molossid here and Dasypterus iga in here. I can recognize the call pattern by the alternating FC. But these are all visually. Oh, here's Centronectrus again. Centronectrus. Here's one of the first things people automatically recognize. It's Pteronodus mesoamericanus, the only species with a long constant frequency. Although now we know there's 7 or 8 species that do that in the New World tropics. Here's a fragment, Centronectrus. So with the visual settings the same, it was real easy to pick out these call shapes. They're always exactly in the same place. The call shapes are automatically the same shape all the way along. So here we have our Sarcopteryx, here we have our Centronectrus. Now we're going to look at the same 20 call files, this time using different settings for time, frequency scales, and some of them I'm going to have set to linear rather than log scale. Okay. Here the time is compressed differently, so you're not seeing the call parameters. Oh, here's a linear scale for 40 kilohertz. So Centronectrus is dropped down here. The call shapes look differently. Here's same thing, Centronectrus, but the time scale has changed. Here we've got a linear scale, and we've got Sarcopteryx, and we've got a Pteronodus over there. Oh, now we've changed to a log scale, and the Sarcopteryx is up here. Oh, a linear scale again. Oh, now the time is expanded for the Centronectrus. It's not in 10 milliseconds. The call shapes look different. Oh, here we go with Sarcopteryx again. A different frequency scale. Instead of 10 to 110, this is set 15 to 80. So if the frequency scale is different, your call shapes are going to look different. This is not compressed. Here we go back to our standard setting. We can identify that one. Oh, again, linear. So you can see jumping around from one setting to the other makes it really difficult to recognize the shapes and patterns because not only are the scales constantly changing, but the call shapes you're trying to learn are constantly changing. So your key lesson for today in this longer one is to make sure you have your backcall software display set to a reasonable XY axis. Use compressed mode. Your right brain will recognize the call shapes and patterns, and you're quickly going to learn the key groups of taxa. Again, if your display is constantly changing, learning the call shapes is going to be difficult, as the diagnostic shapes also change. So now, we looked at CAPTCHAs at the beginning for security to get into backcall, or not backcalls, excuse me, to a given program to prove you're not a robot. So I think now, since you're all beginning to master visual recognition of calls, I should add a new CAPTCHA so you can complete the rest of your micro lessons in this series. And there's probably going to be 30, 40 different lessons in the series. And you do this to verify you're a bat or you're a bat biologist. So if we put the new CAPTCHA in there, and you need to select all the calls with morphoapids. Which squares have morphoapids? So visually, your pattern recognition should pick that up. Well, actually at this stage, I don't expect many of you will be able to progress because you haven't practiced yet. Also note, for the CAPTCHA squares, there's no time or frequency access. There's no values of any kind, mainly because they're not necessary to recognize the broad taxa. So how many morphoapids are there in these 9 windows? Here's a hint. 3 squares have morphoapids. This one, and this one. And then we have 2 emballonurids, this one and this one, 2 mollusids, and a noctilio and a vespertilionid. So your right brain will recognize all these distinctive shapes as long as you make sure your software settings are set at a standard set of values. Once you've come up with a set of values you like and is comfortable for you to recognize the call shapes, always use the same for all your displays as you're learning. As you get more experienced after several months, you may change some of these as you go through a little bit quicker. But to begin with, stick with the basic call parameter viewing so the call parameters are not constantly changing with the display characteristics. So if these lessons were useful and you want to continue, hit the subscribe button to notify when the next one is available. Until then, let's agree with the rodents. We need to save the angels, and by listening carefully, we always can tell who they are.